atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, attorney and former deputy assistant to President Trump, May Mailman.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, May, how are you this afternoon?
I am great. How are you?
I am doing okay. It's been a long week, and I am looking forward to a little bit of a break from all the chaos this weekend as we move into the final stages of the presidential race. And of course, we're going to be talking about that. Before we do, though, I want to thank a new Patreon supporter, Patreon trial supporter, Mark. Mark, thanks for trying us out, and we hope you become a regular non-trial supporter in that. So, like I said, we have a lot of election-related stuff to talk about. I don't know about you, May, but this is a weird time. I've always felt this is a weird time because with Congress out and nothing really happening in policy, it's just that kind of, it's like that week before the Super Bowl where you kind of know all the storylines and everything that's going on, and now it's just waiting for the main event, you know? So, I don't know. But one of the things that we are seeing is a number of media outreach events on both sides. And this week we saw Kamala Harris going into, I guess I'll call it the lion's den of Fox News for an interview with Fox's chief political anchor, Bret Baier. And in the interview, Baier frequently interrupted Harris, and they kind of both talked over each other quite a lot. And while a lot of folks called it sort of a negative kind of almost angry environment, to me, it seemed contentious, but I would say not exactly uncivil, you know. And Baier opened up with immigration, which was the focus actually of well over a third of the interview. Then followed that with taxpayer-funded gender reassignment surgery for prisoners. And Harris sort of tried to work in, I think, as much as she could about her economic plans compared to Trump's proposals. And actually here, I was surprised that Baier didn't have anything to say about inflation during the Biden years. The word inflation didn't come up in the entire interview, which kind of surprised me. And then they also discussed foreign policy, but not Russia, not Ukraine, not China. It all centered on Iran and Israel, which is another thing I thought was kind of weird. And Harris made some attempts to distance herself from Biden. She said her administration wouldn't be a continuation of the Biden administration, but she didn't mention any actions taken by Biden with which she disagreed. And during the interview, Harris was, I would say, to me, it seemed like she was most notably animated in her denunciation of Donald Trump's angry, divisive rhetoric, his calls to use the military against what he calls the enemy within. So that's kind of my just general overview. But May, what did you take away from Harris's interview? And I guess maybe even more importantly, because it's not going to change your vote for sure, or mine, but how do you think it would play with that kind of small but critical number of undecided voters in swing states who might have been watching it or hearing clips from it?
I guess I just don't think that it changed anyone's mind. And part of me has such low expectations, which is so bad. Like, this is somebody who's running for president of the United States. And the thing that I'm looking for is she going to be able to survive the interview? You know, is she going to say something so outrageous or so stupid or expose herself as so liberal? Like, that's what I kind of go into something like this thinking. And you know what? She didn't fall flat on any of those things. I think there's not really a totally viral clip of her saying something harmful to her campaign. So in that sense, she beat my expectations. But it's frustrating because why are my expectations this low? You know, why can't I say, you know, immigration really has been a failure of the Biden administration, I think. Whether you say border security or actually immigration, neither one has taken, I think, good steps. And I'd like to hear her reflections on that. What would she have done differently? What does she think? And you don't. I don't have any of that. Okay, fine. Pick another topic. It just, Kamala Harris is a policy lightweight. I think she knows that she's a policy lightweight. I think that's why she hasn't done hard-hitting interviews. And that's why her most animated moment was President Trump sucks. And she already has the President Trump sucks vote. And she doesn't need to get angry and combative. I don't think that. At first, I thought that actually played well for her because it'll, that's what her base wants and thinks, and, get exercised about that. But for a lot of people, I don't think that plays really well, and she's got to know that. And so that actually reflected a little bit of a lack of self-control. So I feel like I didn't hear any policy expertise. I didn't hear any real, as you say, policy differentiation from President Biden. I saw a little bit of just an angry demeanor. Yes, it was a combative interview, but I think that there is a need for that for her, because all she's done is talk about her workout routines on the Call Her Daddy podcast, and there is a criticism that she really does need to. So I think a combative interview could have been really positive for her. I just don't think that. I think this was a wash.
Yeah, I think on that. We've seen both sides essentially retreat to softball safe sort of forums. I mean, and when they have been pushed in interviews where they weren't necessarily getting the easiest questions, like maybe Harris on Fox, or you could take, I think, the same week, Trump with the Bloomberg guy, you get the sense that they're both, certainly Trump, talk about policy lightweights. I mean, right there. But to me, I get that, because I think just the name of the game more generally in politics these days, given how polarized we are, is just playing in that safe space and energizing your base and so forth. And I had hoped for more from Vice President Harris on this. I will say on the immigration point, substantively, I feel like Harris and Biden have a reasonable argument here. And I think she made that argument. But I don't think that argument, even if I see it as reasonable, which is essentially, hey, we had a bipartisan agreement. Donald Trump blew it up because he wanted to run on the issue as opposed to solve the problem. I think that's a good argument, but I don't think it's the kind of argument that convinces a lot of unconvinced voters. And so that I found problematic. And I guess my biggest disappointment was she had to know that the question about how are you different from Joe Biden was coming. That's an obvious one. And so, okay, she said the important thing, my administration will not be in continuation. But then when she went on to explain why it wouldn't, well, because I haven't been in Washington, D.C. my whole life. And that, to me, that was a real missed opportunity. If she can't find 2 or 3 areas in which she could say, listen, here's where I differ from President Biden, I think it's really hard for her to make the case that she is, in fact, different. And maybe it was a loyalty, don't want to throw the boss under the bus thing. I don't know that I really buy that. I just feel like it was a real missed opportunity for her if she really was hoping to connect with undecided voters, maybe some center-right female voters, who I think is probably the demographic that's watching Fox that she's most likely to peel away a few votes from. I don't really see that as having had much of an effect. So I guess we agree on that, right?
Yeah, I think her little blurb that she had prepared was fine. I'm a DC outsider. That is, I think, a difference from Joe Biden, who's been in DC forever. I mean, this is kind of a play on age, but also, she doesn't have Hunter Biden out there picking up bags of cash from foreign countries. Okay, this is different. I'm not Joe Biden. She then kind of talks about her economic plan. I'm going to build new houses. I'm going to give people more money, $25,000. I'm going to give money to small businesses. Okay, so I'm going to have all this money, and I'm not from DC. I don't know if that's different from Joe Biden, but at least it's a blurb. But then when pushed just a little bit, and this is what I've always been frustrated about, is even in that CNN interview that she initially did with Tim Walz, there were some, kind of interesting questions, but but there just needed to be one more follow-up question. Okay, what do you mean by that? Okay, you say that your values haven't changed on fracking. Explain, tell me about that. And so I think Bret Baier then said, okay, but you're saying that it's time to turn the page. Turn the page from what? And she goes immediately to turn the page from the rhetoric of Donald Trump. And it's like, what? What? That doesn't make any sense. And she said, well, you know what I'm talking about. And Bret Baier said, I actually do not. So, Bret Baier says 70% of people say the country is on the wrong track. They're not saying that because of Trump's tweets. They're saying that because of your policies. What do you say to those people? That's 70%. And the fact that she doesn't have a message to that 70% of people and just says, we're ready to not be divisive anymore. Like that is, I think, political malpractice. You have to have a good answer to that question.
Yeah. And I guess I feel that when he asked her why so many Americans support Trump, if Trump is as awful as she says, and then he said, well, is the American public stupid or misguided? And she said in response, I would never say that about the American people. Okay, that's fine. But that's not an answer to I guess this is why I hate almost all of these events, because, and in my very limited experience, but some experience interviewing politicians, it's so hard to get a straight answer out of any of them. And I feel like this, again, was maybe a missed opportunity because she had to know that question was coming. And she could have said something like, I don't know, Donald Trump and his supporters have done a great job of giving Americans this sort of distorted, angry view of reality. And I get that it resonates with them. And here's why I think this is. And here's what I would do differently to bring something. And it was just frustrating to me that she just seemed so very scripted. And I get that. I mean, this is what happens when you get a lifetime politician, essentially. And she might be a DC outsider, but she's been in politics essentially her whole adult life. And California politics is big time politics. So it's not like she's this non-political person. And I feel like this is one of my biggest frustrations with my party is that we keep on picking these sort of safe people who can get through primaries and say the right things to the donor class and those folks. And I feel like we're missing a huge opportunity to connect with folks who want to hear some of what I feel is the realness of Donald Trump without the sort of crazy aspect of it. I mean, I think you can be authentic and not go on some kind of weird rant about how your opponent hates cows. And if you love cows, you better not vote for Kamala Harris, which is kind of a weird recent Trump thing. But I think you get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah. At some point, I think that this country is a center-right country. And that if we were to have a conversation about policies, the parties actually wouldn't be maybe that far apart. Some differences on whether the federal government should run things versus the state versus private, but like in general, I think. But in order to have primaries and then have general elections, people are just trying to differentiate. And so then it ends up getting just so stupid. And yeah, that's, I think, where we are, especially now where people are spending more and more money and more time going after a shrinking part of the population, a population that they don't even know what news they're watching, what entertainment they're watching, what websites they're on, the messages that resonate with it. It's just like, it's a teeny tiny part of the population. And they don't know policies necessarily. And so there's pandering in ways that don't make any amount of sense, but that's the stage of the election where we're in, is pandering to the lowest information voter.
Yeah. And in thinking about the topics, and now I understand that if I understand sort of the background for this interview, that it kind of started a little bit late and they didn't have necessarily the time to get into some things. But if you just look at the topics, first topic, of course, it was going to be immigration. I'm here in Ohio and I can't turn on, Hulu or something, because I'm cheap. I get the versions with the ads, right? And so, I mean, it's all immigration all the time. And so, of course, that was going to be the first thing. And it took up like more than a third of the interview. I get that. But it was bizarre to me that the second question, before so many other things that I would argue that were so much more important, is federal funding for gender transitioning for prisoners, which, as far as I can tell, there have been 2 instances of that happening, literally 1, 2. The idea that this is a serious policy issue that would matter to any group of Americans. I mean, if you want to make the argument about women playing in men's sport, biological women, okay, that's a slightly bigger thing, but still, the idea that this is going to be more important than abortion, climate change, crime, China, Ukraine, and maybe that gets into that whole kind of low information voter sort of thing. But in terms of the issues that matter to Americans every day, or that I would argue should matter, what they're paying for groceries, what they're paying for healthcare, job security, none of that came up. And we spend so much of this time on these just bizarro issues to me. I don't know what you think about that.
So I think the opposite. And you kind of mentioned male athletes and female sports teams, which the Wall Street Journal just had an article about it. And I think that there are going to be more articles written about it because I've been interviewed about the American public's attention to these types of issues. And it's sports mostly, but sometimes it's surgeries and things like that. And I think people care about it for a couple of reasons. One is it does seem very radical and very unfair when you see at the Olympics a XY athlete competing against women, or the Leah Thomas situation. Like, it strikes people's emotions, and emotions are how people vote. And so in that sense, like, anybody who's on the side of something that emotionally feels wrong, that feels unfair, that feels violent, in locker room situation, feels sexually violative, you don't want to be on the side of those people. So I think, like, even just because an issue is small doesn't mean it doesn't matter. I mean, let's just take police shooting of unarmed Black people. I think if you look, the Washington Post tracks them, it's like 9 per year. Okay. This is not something that's happening outside of your front door. And yet it is a very big emotional, I mean, billions of dollars of property damage, and people died because of this issue. So just because it seems small does not mean it's actually small. But then also, I think it's an indicator. It indicates that if you're in favor of these types of policies, that, taxpayer funding for gender reassignment surgery, sex trait modification surgery, I think that it shows that you are part of either an elite class, or you're part of a group that doesn't think like me. Those are other people. Other people believe that that's right. And maybe it's not the issue itself, but it just puts you in a sort of Ivy League. I don't have to worry about the effect of these issues. I'm not a female prisoner. I don't have to worry about men being in prison with me. Like, it others you in this not in my backyard elitist class that people don't want to vote for.
I feel like in some ways it's maybe in part a failure of messaging on my side of things to not kind of bring home these sort of bread and butter economic issues that I think are, I'm not saying that these issues are unimportant, but what I'm saying is that I think to most Americans, regular folks, everyday issues like, okay, how am I going to afford to feed my kids? And Timmy just broke his arm. What are we going to do about that? How do we pay this bill and the gas bill? And these are the things that I feel really make a difference to hundreds of millions of Americans, as opposed to so many of these just incredibly fringe type issues. And part of the things that frustrated me about this interview is that I don't think Vice President Harris did enough actually to try to weave those in. Now, she didn't get much of a chance. I mean, clearly Brett Baer, who I think is one of the better journalists on the Fox side of things, I think he tries to play it more or less straight, but he came in pretty hot, obviously, with that. You talk about the emotional thing. You know, what do you say to these these parents of these dead kids? I mean, wow, that was coming in pretty hot on that sort of thing. And I guess it just frustrates me as not a low information voter that we don't spend nearly as much time as I would like on more substantive things, like the sort of questions that Bloomberg asked Trump about. Well, hey, almost every reputable economist says your tariffs are just going to be a disaster for the economy. And Trump just gets all huffy and says, well, you don't know what you're talking about. And they don't either. And it's just depressing to me, I guess, in a lot of ways. Or also, I think, though you can make the argument, I certainly feel that Harris was right to get agitated and emotional when you have Donald Trump, who I think has a very good chance of being the next president, saying, hey, I think it would be very easily handled, these sick people on the left, by the National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military. That's a awfully bold, scary sort of statement for the potential next president of the United States to be making, and I think it should be called out.
Yeah, I've always been, I don't understand the agitation with Trump language, or, he says enemy of the people. He's not like referring to some thing he read and it's like, this is 4D chess and he's trying to the question was, if you're, if there's going to be chaos in the aftermath of the election, should the National Guard be called in? And I think one of the big criticisms of Trump was that he didn't, or did too late on January 6th. And that his answer is yes, that to protect law and order after the election, it is appropriate to consider and then potentially use the National Guard. I think in context, none of that was particularly shocking. But if Kamala Harris wants to bring it up, that's fine. I just think you already have the I hate Trump vote. You got that. And you're not going to get more of it by Project 2025. He's a dictator. You're not going to get more of it by, he said bloodbath, or it's just he's going to have a abortion registry, or if people are scared of and do not like and are willing to think that Trump is going to do all these things, you've already got them. At some point, you have to explain what you're going to do. And so, yeah, maybe talking about the economy would have been useful. I feel like all the debate started off with the economy, and you get into, I grew up in a middle class family, and so I know what it's like. It's like, okay, both of your parents were professors, but whatever, okay. And Donald Trump had COVID. And so we've heard this answer so many times. Oh, and then here's some free money. She gets asked on the economy all the time, and it's just, here's some free money and I'm middle class. And so I guess there's I'm not interested in that answer. I've heard that answer. And talking about her radicalism on cultural issues, I call it radicalism. Maybe other people think it's mainstream, but at least 70% of Americans disagree with her on a cultural basis, I think is interesting and is useful. And I think she had a fine, but not whatever. It was a nothing answer. I'm going to follow the law. I don't know what that means, but okay. I mean, I do, because I do this for a living, but most people don't know what that means. Yeah, I think it's okay to hit culture. I think Glenn Youngkin showed that being on the normie side of culture can get you pretty far.
Yeah. I don't know that while 70 something percent of Americans may feel we're on the wrong track, I wouldn't say that necessarily equates to 70 something percent disagreeing with Kamala Harris about various cultural issues, though I certainly believe that in general, my party has gotten out a little bit too far ahead of voters on some of these issues. So, turning to, I guess, something else that wasn't really talked about, it was weird to me. And I think actually Brett Baer was kind of surprised when he asked about the biggest threat to the United States. And she answered Iran, and he seemed almost taken aback, saying, well, some of your own people, in fact, even the FBI director says it's China and you say it's Iran. It seemed to me that the reason she said that is not because she believes that Iran is the greatest threat, but because she wanted to get in some points about support for Israel, which obviously she couldn't do if she said the main threat was China, unless she would kind of do it in a roundabout way, saying, well, you know, China supports Iran and Iran is going against Israel. But I don't think that anyone thinks that. I hope people don't think that Iran is a greater threat to the U.S. than China.
I hope not, too. I agree with the FBI director that it is China when you think about China's strategic plan to make the United States irrelevant and essentially fighting proxy wars through Iran and through Russia. And so I don't think if that was her strategy, which is I'm going to say Iran in order to appease the pro-Israel crowd, the pro-Israel crowd that watches Fox News is probably already not going to vote for her. And so this did come up during her 60 Minutes interview. So that makes some sense, I guess. But even still, it's China that's hosting Hamas for meetings. Like, I still think it made her appear to not understand foreign policy more than it did make her appear to be pro-Israel.
Yeah, I think in general, though, since we're talking about probably her trying to appeal to those lowest information voters, that sort of more nuanced argument about China probably wouldn't necessarily go anywhere. And not only that, but it's not like, and we'll get into this probably in the Bone and Midweek show, it's not like there's necessarily a ton of distance between at least the Biden administration and the previous Trump administration on China. And so if your goal is to accentuate differences, you might not want to talk about areas in which you could say, well, you know, we're probably going to do the same thing that the present administration is doing. And that's pretty much what the last administration did. That's not really a good use of your time when you have 20 something minutes in an interview, I don't think.
Yeah, but I think that an experienced interviewee could say something like, I think it's China because blah, 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 but I also don't want to minimize the importance of Iran here and our support for Israel. Like, it's not a difficult answer. But this is the woman who said, I want to explain that Russia is a country next to Ukraine and Russia is a bigger country and Russia is a stronger country. So foreign policy is not her forte. Foreign policy is also not my forte. I'm also not running for president. So I just think that she continues to expose that it's not a forte. And that should be a concern, because if it were up to me, the president would do almost no domestic policy and would essentially just be focusing on our foreign relations. But apparently people want their president to be mostly focused on transgender surgeries and the like. And that's just where we are. You got to meet the people where they are, I guess.
See, and I don't think that's the case at all. I agree with her that largely this uproar about this has been manufactured, and most people on the left don't really care all that much about it. Not to say that if asked about the issue, what do you think about this? But I'd say, well, yeah, sure. If someone wants to get a procedure, that sort of thing, maybe that's okay. But I think that it's been blown up into some, and I get why, because it is, as you said before, it's this kind of cultural bright line sort of issue where a lot of culturally conservative people just see this as just a bridge too far. And I get why they would do that. But again, to me, it really draws our focus away from the important things that are really going to affect the American public, depending on who gets elected. And one of those things, as the Bloomberg interview with Trump pointed out, is that these tariffs are going to be that he wants to put in place are going to be rough, and he might not want to admit it. And that's the kind of bottom line economic issue that's really going to hurt a lot of people. And I really wish there were more focus on this, but I'm not naive. I know that's not going to happen. Any other thoughts on what did happen, what didn't happen in the interview? And again, as you said, I certainly wouldn't argue that Kamala Harris is any one of the policy heavyweights on the Democratic side. Then again, she's going against Donald Trump, who is without a doubt a policy lightweight. And so it's not like there's a ton of policy expertise on either side of this. Although I would certainly argue, as someone left of center, that what Donald Trump thinks he knows on policy is much worse than what well, anyway. So any other thoughts?
It's funny. So I agree. Obviously, Donald Trump he's not a politician. He's a business guy, and his policy expertise goes as far as it goes. But he's I think he's a good politician in the sense that he knows what resonates with voters. He's a great messenger in that sense. He created The Apprentice. Like, this is somebody who knows how to talk to people, including building his Twitter account, people following that. So he's got the strength in being a politician over a policy person. And I think the strength of people viewing fondly the economy during the Trump years. And so Kamala Harris, I think, she's not going to be the stronger politician. I mean, this is somebody who garnered no delegates during the primary and dropped out before her home state. This is not somebody who really understands, I don't think, the American people. At best, they don't know her, but she's a liberal politician from California. And so I think her strength has to be policy. Like, if that's where Trump's strengths lie, and you're not going to beat him on that, then either it's just going to be pure brute force, like scooping up votes through the League of Women Voters, or it has to be policy. And I think that I don't think that she, quote unquote, lost this interview. I don't think she lost any support. I don't think she gained any support. But that to me puts it kind of like where Trump was during the debate, which is, if you missed this opportunity, this was an opportunity to reach a whole different set of viewers, to either paint your opponent or to gain votes yourself. And if you didn't achieve that, then I think you do put it in the L category, even though I think, like I said, I don't think she did poorly in the sense there's nothing like bad or negative or viral coming out of it. So yeah, the one thing that I guess I really didn't like was the anger, but otherwise I thought whatever.
So I guess in the end, I think your analysis isn't unreasonable. I think there's a lot to it, but I guess I would argue that Donald Trump isn't nearly the politician that, say, a Ronald Reagan or a Barack Obama were, because Donald Trump, while he is immensely, I guess, charismatic to a certain group of people and draws them in and gets energized support, he has a hard ceiling. And he has a sort of ceiling that an Obama or a Reagan didn't have, because they understood how to appeal to a broader group of Americans that Trump, just by his very nature, by his very psychology, can't. And so I would say, yeah, he's better. He's better in a lot of ways in that than Harris, but not nearly as good as some of what I would consider the greats. And on policy, I would argue that certainly while Harris doesn't have a Pete Buttigieg type level of policy wonkiness, or Elizabeth Warren or someone like that, I certainly think that generally speaking, she knows a lot more about what she's talking about on policy than Donald Trump does. And now, obviously, we're both coming at this from our own sort of pre-existing biases on this. And so that's why I think in the end, she'll have just enough to kind of overcome some of those advantages that Trump has. But we will find out in, I guess, 17 days, right? Yeah. And speaking of that, May, like I said, there are, in fact, as we record this Friday afternoon, there are 17 days to go until the election. And, you know, I think it's shaping up to be, well, every bit as close as we've been expecting, right? I mean, polling averages in the 7 swing states that are going to decide the outcome, they're all within the margin of error. And pretty much every major forecast has it as more or less a coin flip. Now, I think we've got a little bit more clarity when it comes to the Senate. It seems almost certain that Democrats are going to lose Montana and West Virginia, and Republicans will gain control of the chamber. The House, I would say probably another coin flip, though my argument would be, well, Democrats probably have a slight advantage. They've got a lot more money in contested races, and also there are 19 Republicans defending districts that Biden won in 2020 compared to just 8 Democrats defending districts that Trump carried in the last election. And May, this is the last time that you'll be on before the election. And depending on how our schedule shakes out, it might be my last pre-election episode. So it's our last shot at fearless election predictions. So I thought we'd do that, starting with the big one, who we think will win the presidential election and what we think the final electoral vote count will be. And listeners know that for a while, I've been thinking that it's probably Trump's race to lose. I'm going to push aside a little bit of my pessimism in favor of what I hope is rationally optimistic view of things and predict that Harris is going to win with 274 electoral votes, just squeak through, right? 274 to 264. That I think gets us to 538, if I'm doing the math right. And here's how I get to this. I think that of the 7 swing states, Trump wins Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona. Harris carries Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and the all-important state, Pennsylvania. And I think the reason why I have at least some optimism at this point is that it seems to me from everything I've been hearing and reading, the Harris campaign is better funded and seems to have a better ground game and a better get out the vote or operation than Trump's side does. And I think that's going to matter in the end in some of these really close races. So before we go any further, what's your presidential prediction?
So the betting markets are from Kalshi are 58% for Trump, but I'm a pessimist. So I have perpetually told people if they ask, I don't think Trump is going to win. There were 2 weeks-ish where I thought he was after the Biden debate when it looked like Biden was going to cling on. But now I'm starting to get optimistic again. And I almost hate to say it out loud because it reminds me of when I was in the White House and people were going to Trump rallies in the last weeks before the election. And even though all the polls were very against Trump, they were like, I really think that he's going to pull it off. I think he's going to do it. And of course, he did close a lot of that polling gap. So the polls were off again, but he didn't win. But if you had to tell me, I have to pick, I don't know. I guess I don't think Trump's going to win. I don't think they're going to let another Hillary Clinton happen. And when I say they, I mean the ballot harvesters, like the ground game. The Democrats just have better ground game.
And that's not necessarily, I mean, I would argue that's a good thing. You get those, I mean, when Harris became the nominee, there was an amazing surge, not just a money surge, but a volunteer surge, those door knockers, those people driving folks to the polls and all that. And of course, that's all entirely legitimate. And I would argue a positive sort of thing. And it's really been an area where Republicans, I think, historically have maybe had a little harder time than Democrats had.
Yeah. And so the reason I'm so torn on this is because the polling really is a lot better for President Trump than it was in 2020. Yeah. So let's just take, and you have on your, prediction that Trump will win, for example, Arizona. And if you look at the polling in Arizona, at this point, Biden was winning Arizona, Real Clear Politics average, by 4 percentage points. And the delta is now, today, Trump is winning Arizona by 1.5 percentage points. So it's like, wow, Trump is really overperforming. And then, typically Trump overperforms the polls. So if it was just up to polling, I would say I think Trump wins. And then the second question is ground game. And I actually do think that there is a cultural difference. I think Republicans are willing to go at least do early voting. I don't know still about mail-in voting, but use that early voting window. I think the first day of Georgia early voting broke records. So you have Republicans getting out the message of swamp the vote, go get out there early. And for Pennsylvania, because I think it does all come down to Pennsylvania, the delta between registered Democrats and registered Republicans has always favored Democrats. Always, always, always since they've tracked this number. But it's the smallest delta that there ever has been. So people have been getting out there and registering Republicans. And then I think targeting a few very specific groups like the Amish, who culturally are conservatives. So I think it is so close because I see all of that as really positive for the Republicans. The polling, increased ground game. I just don't see how Democrats let another Hillary Clinton happen again. Like I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but that's what everybody talks about when like they're not going to let it happen. They're not going to let him win. And I feel like that. So anyway, I am pessimistic in that sense.
So it sounds like now I don't want to read into what you're saying, so I'm going to ask you for a clarification. When I hear that, because when I hear that, I could take it two ways. One way to take it is that when you say Democrats aren't going to let him win, that means they're going to be so energized and so out there and getting people to vote and doing all that stuff that Trump's folks won't be able to make that up in the final analysis. Another way of looking at it, in a darker way, is saying that Democrats are going to somehow systematically cheat, and that's going to be and so one of those things obviously is perfectly okay if you're determined not to let the other side win, because hey, if you think Donald Trump is an existential threat of democracy, you should get out there to vote. You should take folks to the polls. You should do everything within the law to get turnout for Kamala Harris. But I get the sense, maybe I'm wrong here, you tell me, that maybe you're suggesting a little bit of the skullduggery side of things, the illegal side of things, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, so you tell me.
So that is definitely what people who I talk to are concerned about. And it's not because, Trump says, it's like they just genuinely see Trump derangement syndrome as so severe that like if somebody's a threat to democracy, there's no way that people in charge will let a threat to democracy win. And people can't exactly put their finger on what it is, but that's because like, who are we? Like, this is just, if you're a school teacher, you don't know the levers that can be pulled. And so I do sense that there is like definitely that. I am the opposite of a conspiracy theorist. I'm as just, okay, 2020 was quote unquote rigged in the sense that, I don't know, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all these were against Trump, and the New York Times, the New York Post, or not the New York Post, but the Washington Post, like, yeah, that you're going up against Behemoth and all the money and the Mark Zuckerberg money and all these swing districts, like all of these things that are legal, but that are not fair exist.
I guess, the fair thing kind of always, I don't know, not exactly amuses me, but kind of bemuses me, I guess, because it seems to me that for a person and a party that seems to pride itself on these traditional American virtues of toughness, this snowflakeness, I feel from some elements on, it's not fair that the New York Times doesn't like us. I don't know, the fair thing just to me feels a lot like whining about not getting a call from the refs when you were holding anyways. That's just kind of my take on that.
I can appreciate the whininess thing. And that's, I think, how I felt about mail-in voting. If it's like, oh my gosh, mail-in votes, they're the take-home test of elections. You don't know what happens.
Sure.
It felt whiny. Like, obviously there are true criticisms of mail-in voting, including that you don't know whether your vote is going to be counted because the mail does get lost. And if I truly cared about my vote counting in like a swing state, I would feel much more comfortable going early in person than I would just like plopping something in the mail. So criticism doesn't have to be whininess, but I do think that there's an edge there, and sometimes Republicans go over it. But, do I just assume everything is the Veep and not West Wing. And so it's like, are the Democrats or
I like that.
Whatever, the billionaires or whoever, are they smart enough? Are they coordinated enough? Are they cunning enough to actually rig an election? I always tend to think no, right? Like it's always the Veep and never the West Wing. But if people have a different perspective and think that there are people who are capable of I don't know, various misdeeds and are able to do it in a quiet way, then there are a lot of people who think that's going to happen, in part because if you've ever talked to people who really genuinely do think that Trump is going to be the end of our country, how could they not? How could they not? How could you not? If you had the opportunity to save our country from somebody who's going to end the country, how could you not? And so, but I think people are too stupid. So I guess that's where I am.
And certainly, I think we hear that on both sides. I mean, Donald Trump saying you're not going to have a country anymore if this woman wins. This crazy, incompetent woman. I mean, they're both, they got the apocalyptic meters turned up to, 12 at this point, because that's just what we've come to expect. And it's just horrifically bad. I think Donald Trump, no matter who wins this election, it is not going to be the end of the country. It's not going to be the end of democracy. It's just not. And people who believe that are just flat out wrong. And I know there are good people who believe that. I have a family member who says, listen, we're going to have World War III if Kamala Harris is elected. And he fervently believes that. And that scares me more than anything else, because I know there's a lot of that on both sides.
Yeah. So I think that type of rhetoric and witnessing 2 attempted assassinations has people concerned that if there's not sufficient poll watchers, if there's not sufficient checks, if there's not sufficient transparency, there's going to be a lot of distrust. So my hope is that if it's a blowout, but my other hope is that there's just going to be tremendous transparency. But as far as predictions are concerned, I guess, what people will always tell me is like, if it's a fair fight, then Trump will win. That's I think what I hear the most often. But what's my prediction is that Trump is not going to win.
I think that's what both sides want to believe, is that clearly the American people are behind us. And if they're not, then it's either the other side's cheating or we're not messaging well enough. But there are very few people in the world of politics who get into their bubbles, who can get to the point where they say, well, hey, you know what? Maybe our message is just wrong, or maybe our policies are just wrong. It happens, but it only happens occasionally. Like, for instance, in the 80s, when Ronald Reagan twice and then George W. Bush just wiped the Democrats totally out in presidential elections. The Democrats nationally said, oh, my God, we're clearly out of touch. They nominate Bill Clinton, who is way more centrist. You get the centrist Democratic Leadership Committee Council, DLC, and the Democrats tack to the center in a way that really helps them out. But it takes the sort of defeat that is just so sweeping that's not in the cards for either party. And so I think that no matter who wins, it's going to be razor thin. Now, the only way that doesn't happen, I think, is if, in fact, the polling organizations haven't figured out how to adjust for undercounting Trump support in 2016 and 2020. 2020 was a weird year for a lot of reasons because of COVID. But if they haven't, I could totally see a scenario. If I wake up the day after Election Day and they say Trump's carried all 7 of the swing states, has 305, 306 electoral votes, that wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I'd say, yeah, that was a possible outcome, because we just don't know. But we probably won't even necessarily know the day after, because, and again, this gets into, I agree with you that it's very important that ballots be counted in a transparent way, and we have solid rules on this. But what a lot of folks on the left are concerned about is they feel that a lot of Republican states and Republican election boards have tried to put in procedures that have been designed to delay the count and to create fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And so that way, even if their side loses in that state, they can make a not crazy sounding claim that, well, something weird happened because the ballots initially went for our guy, but all of a sudden, how did it happen? They went the other way. Whereas if all the U.S. states had a policy like, say, Florida's, and Florida's, right, that's where woke goes to die, I'm told. I mean, a state where they got their election results in very quickly. They have those ballots that are cast before Election Day counted and ready to go. Florida should be, I would argue in many ways, a model for the nation on this, and we're just not seeing that.
Florida should be a model for the nation. And this is why when I say people are very concerned, these are not crazy people. These are like people with 3 degrees who are very invested voters, like, and they see the length of time it takes in Arizona and the lack of certainty. They see in Nevada that ballots just get mailed out, but they don't clean the voter rolls, like that you don't have to re-register to vote for a new election cycle. And so just ballots are being blasted. Like, they see these things and it gives them great concern. And I don't think that it's wrong to be concerned about that. And I don't think that it's like because they want to sow distrust. Like, they actually, truly, legitimately do not like what they're seeing and would be much happier to see something like Florida, where, you win some counties, you lose some counties, but with great certainty where you stand after election night. And that, I think, so I don't think Republicans should be doing things that simply add uncertainty. But if you're working on top of a terrible system and you're just like trying to tinker around and like make sure that system, at least when people have questions about it, they can get them answered, that's not the right approach at all. Just like, if your system is Arizona's system and somehow you have not figured out how to run an election, we need to go back to square one and figure out how do we redesign our election system to be much more trustworthy rather than simply provide transparency on a broken system.
Yeah, I'm all for that, for sure. And I think,
and I will say that the truth of the matter is, like, predictions are not worth anything, I think, right now, because the race is tied. And like, anybody who is working on campaigns will tell you that the race is tied. And even Nate Silver, who has been, pretty accurate right now, shows the race is tied. Like, his predictions are essentially 50-50, 49.7 to 50.1. So who knows is the real answer.
And, this makes me realize, or not realize, but come back to a point that a lot of folks, at least on the left, are fans of a national popular vote. And I would just say, and I think there's a lot to be said for that, certainly for various reasons. But if you think about how focused we are on how some, small issues with election systems could really we're only focused on 7 states, basically. But if you start looking for every individual, you talk about the legal challenges that we're seeing now would be nothing compared to just the complete mistrust. I think if this were a nationwide thing and people are questioning the votes in every single state. Now that's because we certainly have a system that is maybe 99 point something % accurate. But when you have a race that's this close, that point whatever %, that can make a real difference. All right. Well, I think what we'll do is we'll stop here. And if you want to hear our predictions for the Senate and the House, and also where we want to talk about the recent ruling in Georgia where a judge ruled against a hand count ruling. This is related to election integrity, I guess you could say, as well as we want to get more into Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on our true greatest adversary. That's China. That's all stuff we're going to be talking about in the midweek supporter show. We hope you'll check that out. And if you're not a supporter, you still get the first 10, 12, 15 minutes or so. But if you want to get the whole thing, we hope you'll become a supporter. You can always find support links in the show notes. And if you would like to get that full midweek episode, but you're not in a position to be a financial supporter, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I would be happy to get that set up for you. And of course, there are all kinds of benefits to becoming a supporter. One of them is our Discord group, which is always a lot of fun. It's much more informal than this, and sometimes I get sort of weird on that, but that's just one of the many things. We hope you'll consider doing that. And also, before I go, I just want to say, as always, thank you ever so much to our fantastic executive producers. They are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,